Is at both University of Quebec at Montreal, and also the University of Angers. He's a PhD candidate, and some of you will recognize his supervisor, Philippe Legal. So he's going to talk to us today about the road to endogeneity, history of the interactions between economics, science, and endogenous growth theory. Promises to be really interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for offering me this opportunity to present my work and my research project for my PhD dissertation. And thank you very much to you both for offering this opportunity to young scholars in the field. Okay, so as you said, my main affiliation is France. I work at the University of Angers and currently working at the University of Québec in Montreal. Okay, so my main research interest is contemporary macroeconomics, and more specifically economics of science and endogenous growth theory. And my dissertation is about the links between the two fields in a historical and methodological perspective. So what I will present to you today is my PhD's research project, and the title is The Road to Endogeneity, a history of the interactions between economics of science and endogenous growth theory from 1959 to 1984. Okay, so let me begin very broadly by saying that the concept of scientific knowledge is back at the front of the stage in the social studies of science in the 80s. And three reasons can explain this. The first reason is the development of a social epistemology. I of course refer here to the work of Schuller, which uses social sciences to enlighten epistemological issues. The second reason is debates on recent scientific controversies, such as the Human Genome Project, and the need for a perspective from the social sciences on this issue. And the third reason is the evolution of the organizational structure of universities and the related debates on the commercialization and commodification of knowledge. So the road to hell is paved with good corporate donations. Okay, so what about this concept of scientific knowledge in economics? So in economics, scientific knowledge is at the core of mainly two main fields. The first one is the economics of science. In this case, scientific knowledge is the object of study. And maybe economics of science is a field that is not very well known. So let me do a brief description about what is economics of science. And to get a better understanding of that field, I will define the three types of economics of science you can today identify. I worked on that on paper. So the first type is the old economics of science. The second one is the new economics of science. And eventually the third type is the economics of scientific knowledge. So very briefly, the old economics of science is associated with the work of Arrow and Nelson, as we shall see. And these contributions aim at measuring the impact of science and economic growth. And because of the supposed public good nature of knowledge, provided an economic rationale for state intervention in the post-Sputnik area. In its part, relying on the insights provided by Matthieu sociology of science, the new economics of science by Dasgupta and David, so I was happy we talked earlier about Dasgupta, aimed at studying the different institutions of science and their effect on resource allocation processes. And eventually, the most recent type of economics of science is the economics of scientific knowledge, which doesn't possess a similar article yet, but as I define it, consists of using economic concepts, methods, and tools and conditions in order to deal with epistemic issues. Note that as a consequence of this definition, the work of some sociologists of science or philosopher of natural sciences can be considered as contribution to the economics of scientific knowledge. So the second main field in which scientific knowledge plays a key role is of course endogenous growth theory. In this case, scientific knowledge is a key variable used to explain increasing returns. So even though science and scientific knowledge are at the heart of these two fields, they are, however, seldom linked together. No cross-references are made in the similar papers in the two fields. So what I want to do today, and the goal of my dissertation, is first to show that these two fields cannot be considered separately from an historical and methodological point of view, with Ken Arrow playing a key role in the historical relations between the two fields. The second goal is to show that the trend toward endogenous processes in recent economic analysis can be understood when one looks at the historical links and contemporary interactions between these two fields. So my methodology, I proceeded with methodological and historical systematic comparative study of the papers in the two fields, and I had access to Ken Arrow archives located at Duke University. Okay, so the starting point of that story is Ken Arrow 2 contribution, to seminal contribution in the 60s in the two fields. So let me begin by a very selected bio of Ken Arrow that I will focus on the main points for my purpose. So Ken Arrow was born in 1921 in New York. After his military service during the war, he earned his PhD at Columbia University in 1951. He became associated with the Rand Corporation as soon as 1948 up until 1979, where he finished writing his contribution on the impossibility theory. In 1962, he became the head of Stanford Economics Department for 1 year and a member beside Nelson, Okun, Solo Samuelson, and Tobin of Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, chaired by Walter Lever from 1961 to 1964. As you know, he was awarded the Nobel Prize with X in 1972 for his contributions on general equilibrium theory and welfare economics. Okay, so maybe the most important points of this bio is to remember is the Rand Corporation, and the second one is Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisor, and Arrow is here. Okay, so let me begin to draw the link between the two fields, economics of science and endogenous growth theory, by describing the contribution of Arrow on the economics of science. So, first note that the label economics of science was not used at that time, when the name economics of invention or economics of inventive activities was most often used. There already exists an excellent history of the origin of the economics of invention by David Anshel in 2000. And for my purpose, the main point of his contribution is that Arrow's paper is clearly a product of the Rand Corporation, and the studies on inventive activities laid there in the context of scientific race between US and the USSR in the post-Sputnik era. Indeed, what is important here to remark is that Arrow's paper was first published in 1958 as a Rand paper and not in 1962, the most famous and bizarre version of his paper. As Arrow says himself about his work at the Rand Corporation, my paper on the allocation of resources to invention was written there and benefited greatly from the Rand thinking about innovation. So in sum, Arrow's paper on the economics of invention is a product of his theoretical work on welfare economics and his specific commitment with the Rand Corporation. What should be noted also is that Arrow's paper's first version was thus published exactly the same year as Nelson's associated paper in the Journal of Political Economy, what I will discuss later. So this is Anshel paper the medium is the message, or how context matters, or incorporation, builds and economics of innovation. Okay, so even if the most well-known Arrow's 1959 paper is not the first paper Arrow wrote on scientific activities. Indeed, he published in 1958, and still further incorporation, an economic analysis of the market for scientists and engineers, with Alkian and Cabron, eventually published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. As we shall see, Alkian is also a key character in my story, since he influenced a lot Arrow on his learning by doing model with endogenous growth model. Right. So, as I noted, Arrow's paper Economic Welfare and the Allocation of Resource for Invention was originally published in 1959 for a run contract and not in 1962. So I compare here Arrow's paper's two versions, and this comparison is particularly relevant for my story, since one of the main differences between the two versions is the role played by the concept of increasing returns, which, as it is well known, is at the core of the literature on endogenous growth theory. So between 59 and 62, Arrow changed the term increasing returns to indivisibilities in his paper. So here are a few examples of comparison between the two versions of this paper. So for example, we have then three of the classical reasons for the possible failure of perfect competition to achieve optimality in resource allocation: increasing returns, inappropriability, and uncertainty, which becomes in the inferior version. We have then indivisibilities, inappropriability, and uncertainty. So what are the consequences of this conceptual move? Despite this change, Arrow's paper reasoning and conclusions are exactly the same in the two versions. Increasing returns and indivisibilities both lead to the same idea of economies of scale, rendering social benefits superior to private benefits in the production of scientific knowledge and legitimizing state intervention. Indeed, Arrow assimilated the two concepts when he wrote in 1959, for example, that a given piece of information is by definition an indivisible commodity, and the classical problems of increasing returns or indivisibilities appear here. But this conceptual change is, however, very important for my purpose, since it betrays for the very first time the conceptual, and not only the historical, proximity between the literature on economics of science and endogenous growth theory. So the old economics of science is associated with Arrow's paper and Nelson's paper at the same period. Arrow's and Nelson's career from the end of the 50s until the beginning of the 60s are striking of similarities. Indeed, Nelson was also during the period an economist of science and a growth theorist, and was situated in exactly the same institutional context as Arrow's, mainly the Rand Corporation and Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors. The role played by these two institutions in the development of research projects on economics of science and growth theory is thus also clearly demonstrated by Nelson's contributions. Moreover, the 62 versions of Arrow's paper on economics of science was published in a book edited by Nelson, and Arrow acknowledged himself the proximity of his analysis with Nelson's. And he said, for example, for other analyses with similar point of view, see Richard Nelson. Okay, so because of these important similarities, Nelson's paper, The Simple Economics of Basic Scientific Research, published in the Journal of Political Economy in 1959, is most often associated with Arrow's paper to form what has been labeled the old economics of science. However, there are important differences between the two papers. And in a nutshell, contrary to Nelson, Arrow did not define the concept of scientific knowledge per se, but equated it with knowledge and invention. For Arrow, scientific knowledge would not be something that should be submitted to specific analysis. Secondly, Arrow went deeper than Nelson in his commodification of knowledge, and as we shall see, these two key features of Arrow's paper on economics of science will also be found when we will study more specifically the links between this paper and his endogenous growth model. Okay, so let me sum up with Arrow's paper on economics of science. So in sum, in this paper, Arrow defined knowledge as a public good. He emphasized the role played by information and uncertainty. We saw that between the two versions of Arrow's paper, increasing returns were there in this paper on economics of science. This provided an economic rationale for state funding, of course, in the context of his commitment with Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors. This is clearly a product of the Brown Corporation, and what is important to note here is also his proximity on that topic too with Armin Alkan. And I argued that we don't have a homogeneous world economics of science. Okay, so enough for the economics of science. So I turn now to this model of learning by doing. The implication of learning by doing published in the Review of Economic Studies in 1962. So I'm currently writing a paper on the origin of Arrow's learning by doing model, making returns increasing the philosophical and institutional origins of Arrow's learning by doing model. And the thesis of my paper is that Dewey's philosophy of education, airframe industry studies at the Brown Corporation, and funding opportunities by the National Science Foundations provided respectively the conceptual, modeling, and financial resources to Arrow, so that he was able to build this model. It should be first noted that Arrow's model is not, properly speaking, an endogenous growth model, since the engine of growth eventually depends on the exogenous rate of population. However, it differs from Solo's model by exhibiting global increasing returns to scale. That is the reason why we call this model a neo-Solovian model of growth. Another important characteristic is that Arrow uses rational expectation in this model, and we are only 1 year after most contribution to rational expectation. So the main point of this part is to show that Arrow's learning by doing model is an indirect product of the Brown Corporation, and more specifically of cost analysis in the reference industry led by the organization in the early 60s, and that it relies on the same conceptual tools of his paper on economics of science, mainly externalities effects. So I will deal shortly with the philosophical context of Arrow's model in order to emphasize the institutional conceptual links between his paper and his paper on economics of science. Okay, just a remark. What about the success of Arrow's model? So, Web of Science and citation analysis of the fusion of this model. And so here we are in 62. So it's publication of Arrow's model, and not until 86 Arrow's model was usually used by the community. Okay, so in his collected papers published in 1985, Arrow clearly states that his use of the concept of learning by doing is directly influenced by Dewey's philosophy and the literature about education. If I quote Arrow, the term learning by doing was intended to remind the readers of the doctrines of John Dewey and other leaders of progressive education in the 30s and earlier, though by now doubtless this terminology has been forgotten. So remember that Arrow graduated from the University of Columbia in 1941, where he eventually got his PhD in 1951. Columbia University was hugely influenced by Dewey's thought, since this later taught there from 1904 to his retirement in 1930. Hence, Arrow was actually situated in this Deweyan atmosphere as soon as the early 40s. So a simple search of the concept of learning by doing on GSTOR database for the period 30 to 62 brings up 333 results, among which more than half for the discipline of education. Moreover, among these findings, 118 are found for the period from the 50 to 62, testifying greater interest for this concept at the end of the period considered. So the concept of learning by doing was thus clearly related to the literature on education during the period, especially since the 50s. Moreover, a query for John Dewey shows more than 3,000 references for the periods from 30 to 62, and more than 1,000 from 52 to 62, which shows that Dewey's influence was, as for many authors, renewed in the decade following his death in 1952. So Dewey's philosophy and the concept of learning by doing was thus widespread in the early 60s and constituted common knowledge. As pointed out by Harrow in the citation, these two influences of the learning by doing concept, and on the one hand, and of Dewey's philosophy of education on the other hand, and of Dewey's philosophy on the other hand, are having with Dewey's philosophy of education. Education was indeed one of Dewey's research main themes, as can be testified by his numerous and famous contributions on that topic, like for example the School and Society, or his latest book on that topic, Experience and Education. I'll be short now on this Deweyan influence. So for Dewey, learning means the acquisition of what already is incorporated in books and in the head of the elders. Experience is described by its two principles, continuity and interaction. So I won't go in more details, but it can be shown that Dewey's two principles of experience can indeed be found in Harrow's paper, transformed in economical terms. So let's talk about the institutional context and why it can be said that Harrow's model is also a product of the RAND operation. Studies on learning processes were numerous between the 40s and the 60s, and among them, it can be argued that the most influential in Harrow's papers were those carried out at the RAND Corporation on cost analysis in the handframe industry studies. So note that Harrow served as a weather officer for the United States Army Air Corps from 42 to 46, an experience which led him to publish his first paper on the use of winds in flight planning in 1949 in the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences. So several references to airframe studies can be found in Harrow's learning by doing model. What interested RAND Corporation in the airframe industry study was to measure costs so as to determine the most efficient way to produce airplanes in the Cold War context. Doing so, airframe industry became the most popular case study for RAND analysis. This led to the creation by Novik of the Cost Analysis Department in 1950, which aimed at taking into account the difference of Air Force studies of different kind of costs, material, social, and economical, in order to form what has been called system analysis. So 2 years after quitting the Air Force, Harrow became associated with the RAND up until 1979 and wrote 2 documents directly related to the airframe industry for the organization. So the first one is a mathematical model of an air transportation system, published in 1949 and co-written with a specialist in multivariate analysis, Anderson. In this research memorandum, the authors looked for an optimal solution to the problem of air transportation, which means loading and offloading goods in different bases, taking into account monetary costs such as fuel, personnel, and equipment, and non-monetary costs such as the number of planes used. Still for the RAND Corporation, Harrow published 1 year later another research memorandum with his wife Selma, methodology problems in airframe cost performance studies. And in this working paper, the two authors studied the relationship between cost and performance from a methodological point of view. Performance depends on variables such as speed and range, which are summed up as a concept of technical characteristics. The relationship between cost and performance becomes a technical cost function, which can be divided between material and labor costs. And once again, this study is related to the specification of the learning curve. In 1950, Aero was still working on this topic with his wife Selma and Bradley and published cost-quality relations in bomber airframes. Following their 50 study, the authors predict cost of a bomber airframe by quality of performances represented by the cumulative number of airframes produced. So as pointed by the authors, even though this memorandum is not a study on the learning curve, it was, however, an important analytical tool in their work, and the study confirmed the existence of the learning curve. So Aero's deep knowledge of the literature and cost analysis in the airframe industry and Rund's influence on that knowledge is not only shown by his own contributions, but can also be testified through his collaboration, and that's where we meet again Ahmed Alkan. So indeed, Harrow himself recognizes that he was specifically influenced by Alkan work at the Rund Corporation. He says, I learned about progress curves from the work done at Rund, and especially a survey by Ahmed Alkan. So recall that Harrow also worked with Alkan on the economics of science. Described by Harrow as the most likable, wonderful people, Alkan earned his PhD from Stanford in 1943 and worked as a statistician for the US Army Corps from 42 to 66, where he studied learning processes in the airframe industry and eventually became associated with the Rund at the end of his military service. Harrow first met Alkan at the Rund Corporation, and the two authors were personally and intellectually closely linked with each other. So this is a quotation by Harrow about his personal and intellectual relation with Ahmed Alkan. So for example, I was very highly impressed by Ahmed's careful and yet imaginative analysis of progress curves in explaining the cost of airplanes. Okay, so this is the work of Ahmed Alkan on learning curves at the Rund Corporation. So we can cite in 1949 an airframe production function, reliability of progress curves in airframe production, and which eventually was published in Econometrica in 1963. So just 1 year after Aero's learning by doing model. Okay, so I demonstrated here how Aero used this philosophical and institutional context in the early 60s, mainly the Lewis philosophy of education, cost analysis carried out at the Rund Corporation, and I should have from the opportunities provided by the National Science Foundation as conceptual modeling and financial resources in order to elaborate his learning by doing model and to work more broadly in growth theory. So what about the conceptual framework of this paper? So as in his paper on the economics of science, Aero also relies on externalities effect in his learning by doing model. So as I said, Aero's aim in his paper was to develop a growth model exhibiting increasing returns to scales by taking into account learning processes. And a key characteristic of Aero's model is that he made increasing returns caused by experience compatible with the general equilibrium framework. Because learning by doing is considered as external to the firms in the Marshallian tradition, and is therefore not compensated in the market by a price mechanism. The capital constant return is thus composed of two parts, a private one, market compensated, and a social one, not market compensated, which means the externality. Endogeneity of the process is therefore carried out thanks to externalities and not as in more contemporary endogenous growth model with the hypothesis of private constant returns to capital. So that's what Arrow says. The increasing returns do not, however, lead to any difficulty with distribution theory. As we shall see, both capital and labor are paid their marginal products, suitably defined. The explanation is of course that the private marginal productivity of capital is less than the social marginal productivity, since the learning effect is not compensated in the market. So thus Arrow's model and its methodology is not only a first step towards the formalization of endogenous growth, it is also an answer to the apparent contradiction between the empirical fight of increasing returns in the FM industry and its wish to maintain a general equilibrium framework so that distribution theory doesn't lead to any problem in its model. So I dealt with his paper on economics and science and his learning by doing model. So what are the links between these two papers? So of course three main kinds of link. Historical, between of course the two papers were published at the same period. Institutional, because I demonstrated that two papers are the products of the RUN Corporation. And conceptual links between the both rely on externalities as conceptual tools to make returns increasing or to support the argument in his paper on the economics of science. So is it eventually one research program? So what I was thinking about that. Yes, two stories. Yes, in his novel biography, when he says, 262 papers study the efficiency with which the market encourages innovation and the implication of learning by doing for economic growth. Recently, he said no, because, and he even says the two papers are pretty independent. There are at least two different sources of technological progress, the result of deliberate search for new ideas and the increased solving of small problems as a byproduct of production. Okay?
Is that correspondence with you?
Yeah. Okay, so the theoretical context is, of course, publication by Samuelson, Stigler, and Buchanan on externalities during the 60s. And what is important, when I was asked about Samuelson's influence, he says, the idea of knowledge as a public good seemed self-evident to me, and indeed I always thought that it was very well known. When I read Samuelson's paper, I did not think the case of knowledge as a public good was a new idea. Okay, so to what extent Arrow's paper have influenced contemporary relations between economics of science and endogenous growth theory? How this Harrovian tradition is found, used, maybe more interestingly, modified today, and what are the contemporary links between market theories and endogenous processes? So this is Paul Romer and Robert Lucas. Arrow's legacy is clear in Romer's paper. So indeed they both rely on Marshallian type of externalities to the firm in their models, and the expression Marshallian Arrow Romer's knowledge spillover used in the literature on growth theory, so which stands for Marshall, MAR, knowledge spillover. This spillover aspect is due to Romer's assumption that knowledge is a public good. So here again, Arrow's legacy is clear. And as a consequence of these conceptual and modeling choices, Romer's 1986 most famous maybe paper on endogenous growth model is also like Harrow's 62 contribution, a general equilibrium growth model. So what is also interesting is to see to what extent Romer departed from Harrow's contribution in order to support the originality of his paper. The main difference between the two papers is that in Romer's framework, the externality resides in knowledge, like said by Heckman. In Harrow's framework, it resides in capital. So, and eventually, Romer departs from Harrow's perspective by going towards monopolistic competition and abandoning the general equilibrium framework in his latest contribution. So we can find also this Arabian tradition and how this tradition is used and modified in Lucas' work, where he also relies, so as Harrow did in 1962, on rational expectation. And he also uses a lot of Lucas references to learning by doing. One point is that how scientific knowledge historically began by being equated with knowledge and eventually became human capital, defined as learning by doing, I think deserves more historical research. Okay, so a citation by Akarov in the excellent book of Warsaw as the History of Endogenous Growth Theory is that when Paul wrote that paper, somehow everybody understood that the ball game had changed. It was like in Emily James' novel, The Golden Ball, when a loop passes between the husband and the wife, and suddenly everybody knows that she had had an affair. Suddenly, somehow everyone just knew there was a great deal of new economics to be explored. So what is relevant to this citation is how Harrow's learning by doing model was not recognized in 62, but how the same methodology and conceptual tools by Romer was this time recognized at the end of the 80s by the community. Okay, so I'll be short. So the next character in my story is Paul David. So David is famous for his history matters perspective in economic analysis, and he co-authors with Pata Dasgupta the seminal paper of the New Economics of Science. This is New Economics of Science because the two authors introduce the tacitness of knowledge, a sociological framework, and the related emphasis on the role played scientific institution treated as exogenous by Harrow. So, however, as stated showed, this is, however, clearly in Harrow's line of thought between, because, as he said, the New Economics of Science still treats knowledge in its model as an uncomplicated commodity that is to be maximized. Paul David also worked on growth theory and endogenous processes in his 1975 book on growth theory, where it was the first time that he used this concept of past dependency. And as I says, as my friend Paul David keeps on reminding me, and the rest of the world, all development is past dependent. And what is very interesting from my story is that the concept of past dependency is used in economics of science and even more recently by Johnny Groman and Peacock, and in endogenous growth theory, where it's led to increasing returns. And the key character here is Brian Herzog, who made the theoretical link between increasing returns and past dependency. And what is also not a surprise here is that the foreword to Brian Herzog's book was written by Ken Harrow. And he uses also the same kind of conceptual resources, mainly information, learning by doing, the same kind of examples taken from the healthcare industry study. And Harrow was the one who recommended to Herzog that he work at the Scientific Institute with him on complexity. Okay, once again, this Harrowian tradition is used and modified by these characters because Harrow, when disagree with the link between past dependency and increasing returns, as he said, it seems to me to be an error to attribute past dependence to increasing returns. Rather, it seems to be due to reversibility. This, of course, is not to deny the importance of increasing returns as a factor in economic analysis and in social policy formation. So here again, what is important is to see how the interaction between the two fields, economics of science and endogenous growth theory, work together to make relevant the concept of endogeneity of the process and to use this and modify this Arabian tradition. Conclusion. Okay, so I wanted to demonstrate the existence of an Arabian tradition in the link between economics of science and endogenous growth theory. So in the first part I showed that heteroseminal contribution in the two fields are historically, institutionally, and conceptually related. In the second part, I studied the way this tradition informed, used, and modified in the 80s and in the 90s in the contribution of authors such as Gray Nasser, Paul David, or Paul Romer. And we saw that even though Herod's legacy is clear in their work, each of them refined and modified this tradition, for example, by developing the concept of path dependency. More broadly, my study showed that these authors all tried in their way to make the relevant explanatory variable of their work endogenous. So as I hope to have demonstrated, this trend was dependent of the links and interaction between the two fields of the economics of science and endogenous growth theory, and especially of the way these links originated in Herod's contribution in the early 60s. And I finish here. What is also noteworthy is that all these authors were at one point of their career working at Stanford University. So the idea of an Arabian tradition, the relationship between the two fields, can be also analyzed from a more institutional standpoint. And for example, we can ask, was the work on economics of science and endogenous growth theory at the origin or the consequence of the arrangement with Stanford University? Thank you very much.
Comments, questions?
No, I found this all very interesting. Just week before last, I finished teaching a course in economics of innovation and technology, so it's kind of on my mind. I think for me the issue is that certainly Arrow is very important to many people, but there's a lot of other literature one could bring in, maybe, and other sorts of influences. And the issue is, are you maybe focusing a bit too much on Arrow and some of this? And let me just mention some other. One is the whole issue of the economics of technology and how science relates to technology, and whether that needs to bring in a bit more. And then there's a related issue of the economics of research and development and work on that. There's Willicus's work and so on, and there's a whole agricultural literature on that. You mentioned Arrow on the market for scientists and engineers, but there's also the Stigler Blank MBER study on that, and they get into issues, is there a shortage in that market? So and then there's also MacLup on the economics of knowledge around this time. So there's a much broader literature. But then the other linkage I want to make that should be brought in, that I think really links the two areas of economics of science and then the endogenous growth theory is really what the Romer thing is all about, is the intellectual property issue. And there is a fairly rich literature going back, and as Landis and Poster argue, the key seminal figure in that is actually Arnold Plant. Arnold Plant started, stuff on copyrighted patents going back, 1930s or whatever. So I think there's other connections, and I think especially this intellectual property issue and the market failure issues that poses is probably a key link that I'm not sure you fully brought in.
Well, just following up, that Arnold Plant introduced David Hume's theory of property in exactly this context. It was his patent article in Economica, because the Humean theory requires property to have scarcity. And so without scarcity, property doesn't make sense. And so if you run the sort of argument, is this stuff scarce? And so if it's not scarce, should it have should have a patent and that sort of stuff, so that the plant and
Yeah, well, plants is actually, they're artificially creating scarcity.
that's right, and that's right. And plant is one of his students who are on coast, and then his colleague Harold Demms is going to be working with Alshin. So there's a whole connection that goes through LSE. I think it's the LSE connection, and it's because plant is recovered Hume's work from the treatise to make it applicable to the modern discussions, and that had an enormous impact on the LSE discussion. And as the LSE scholars spread out through the world, that had all sorts of impact.
Okay, thanks.
A very short comment. One good thing about studying people who are still alive is that you can correspond with them. And so maybe what I would do is to get the attention of the audience even more than really to put the piece where you have that statement in the Nobel biography and that piece of correspondence with you just right in front. That would be the first slide or the second slide maybe, and that would really, and you would also at that time have a contradiction to start from. So there would be from the start a question that so and what is the answer? And also the other thing is that as I said this morning in my talk about influence, talking about tradition also, it's a difficult concept. So maybe some statement about to which extent one may use that or not. And for example, you see in the comments that rather than Stanford, where they happen to pass, it's the EEC that's it. So when using concepts like tradition, influence, and all that, some epistemological caveat is in order.
Yeah, thanks. When I read the title at first, I was kind of waiting for a link between what is the connection between economics and science and the importance of endogenous growth theory. And the growth theory literature, you're kind of quoting this back in the heyday when endogenous growth theory was the new thing on the block. And then I think after that, after Paul Romer, there were a bunch of papers on, Larry Summers wrote a paper, and it wasn't even clear whether capital, Granger, causes economic growth. Right? We couldn't even prove with certainty that capital is related to economic growth. So then that throws a lot of uncertainty over the whole literature. And then there were a bunch of papers. I ran 1 million growth regressions by so-and-so, who was at Yale?
Sally Martin.
Martin, right. And so I was waiting for some interesting link, I want to know up front, is endogenous growth theory still standing? Is there something interesting about endogenous growth theory where a new economics of science shows me that I'm waiting for something new and better? Because from what I remember of that growth theory at the World Bank or whatever, the endogenous growth theory couldn't explain fit as well as the traditional solo stuff. And so I was just, if you can fill us in on, is endogenous growth theory still standing firm, or after this crisis are we a little more pessimistic? Would help.
Okay. Well, endogenous growth theory is of course the standard growth theory nowadays. So what I wanted to study is how all these authors work both in these two fields at the same time, and how there is an influence of the way we define and model mainly the concept of knowledge and science in the two fields and these relations. But I don't know if I answered your question, but that's the point of my work.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, I wanted to just underscore what's already been said here, and especially in terms of your last bullet point on a Stanford tradition.
Yeah.
That once you connect it to plant, right? Then one character is meat. And Mead has, external, Arrow may have learned nothing from Samuelson, but it's a far stretch to say I never learned anything from Mead, because Mead's paper then he publishes in welfare economics. And Mead then distinguishes between types of external effects, and those which the market can capture and market cannot capture, in the famous Pease apple example. So that's very much in the heyday. And I would be surprised if you go back to Buchanan and Stubberline, because there's also, Buchanan has LSC essays on costs. So it's a very strong LSC tradition. What Arrow is doing is dynamizing it and putting it in terms of a differential equation. This is the growth theory. And so I'm just underscoring. Mead is an important one. And Mead has the two-sector neoclassical growth model. So Mead is sensitive to this.
Yeah, thanks.
We're just on time, so thank you very much.